Hi everyone, and this is our week 4 video as we prepare to watch the film Dust in the Wind, and that's you'll recognize the scene behind me pretty soon as we watch the film. I want to say a couple of things first about the write-up assignment. So I got a really good question today. I just thought I would provide a little more guidance here. I mentioned in the description of the write-up that it should have good footnotes, and that's for sure because this is a 400 level history class, so hopefully you understand that part. I don't need a bibliography in this assignment. The number of sources here is fairly, controlled and finite and things. So it's not the kind of paper that I need a bibliography for, but I would like to see good footnotes. The film itself does not need to be footnoted because, again, it's pretty clear what's happening. If this was a different kind of paper or a different kind of writing, then you would footnote the film, and you probably learned how to do that. For this assignment, that's not necessary because that's the topic of the whole paper pretty much. But like I said, no bibliography is necessary, but good footnotes are definitely something you just should be able to do pretty easily at this point. And so most of the readings, the regular readings, well, take that back. The article titles are cited in the syllabus fully. For the books that we're reading by Lou and Roy, I think you can figure those citations out. And for the film reviews, I haven't really provided those, but I think you should also be able to construct those and have those look appropriate. So anyway, I wanted to get into the topic of the 70s in Taiwan and this film that we'll be watching. And so again, I hope this way of setting the class up isn't too complicated, but after watching these two films set in the 90s, we are going to take a step back to a couple of films made in the 80s, and I'll try to explain a little bit more of why I chose to do that in a second. So I wanted to move to a couple pretty simple images. And we see here Chiang Kai-shek as the Generalissimo. So again, he's the one that I mentioned first became president of the ROC in China in 1927 and was president almost all the way. There was one incident where he stepped down as president after the failure of the Civil War, but he was essentially continuously president until he died in 1975. And so a lot of what we've been reading about, even though we've been watching films set in the 90s, we've been reading about Taiwan being taken over by the ROC, this idea of getting back to the mainland, the idea of mainland privileges in Taiwan, a lot of the resources in Taiwan being used for the purposes of getting back to the mainland. So some people talk about the fact that in Taiwan history, after the Japanese leave, there's really no period of decolonization, in part because there's something like a new colonial regime that comes. And not everyone agrees with that interpretation, but I think in the way that we're talking about it here, I think it's simple enough, which is that the Japanese used a lot of the resources from Taiwan as, to fuel their empire. And we've already talked about the extraction resources from Taiwan. So after 1945, the island is handed to the ROC, and all of a sudden they're extracting resources in terms of, could be military service, as we're going to see. A lot of the budget, something like 80 to 85% of the budget is dedicated towards the military for the first couple of decades of ROC rules. I mean, it's just unbelievable. So you get a sense of what I mean by the resources being directed towards conquest of the mainland. The person on my right, again, I'm not positive the way that you're seeing this, is his son, Jiang Jingguo. And so he's less well known, I think, in terms of like world history, but very, very important in the history of Taiwan. And so Roy, in the reading for today, I just have these pictures up here because I want to illustrate that transition. I think these two photos actually illustrate that transition pretty well. And so Roy's chapter 6 we're reading for week 4 is called The Opposition Struggle and Breakthrough. And it's on essentially the 1970s, the economic growth of the 1970s, what Roy calls a relentless challenge from the Taiwanese community. And you can imagine how those two things are linked together. That as Taiwan became more and more prosperous, it's pretty easy to imagine people with more demands for political rights. And that's definitely what happens in Taiwan. So the son, Jiang Jingguo, on the right here, hadn't always been a reformer. And so in fact, Roy calls him an unexpected reformer. He was actually the head of the secret police at the time that the ROC moved to Taiwan. So he was actually very feared for a long time in Taiwan as, the son of Chiang and the head of the military, the head of the secret police. Um, but as he took power in 1978 and became president in 1978, and after that point actually made a lot of really interesting choices that helped move Taiwan towards democracy. So I'm looking for a quotation here on page 153, where Chiang says in 1983, so he's 5 years into his presidency, no political party can maintain its advantage forever if it does not reflect public opinion and meet the people's demands. And so you can imagine that as a pretty interesting rebuke to the kind of regime that his father was running, where public opinion wasn't always that important. No political party can maintain its advantage forever if it does not reflect public opinion and meet the people's demands. It's a very Confucian idea for those of you that have that kind of experience, that kind of study. But it also, for our purposes here, just marks a real big difference between the father and the son. And so Roy talks about the 70s into the 80s as a time of much less repression by the government, much more accommodation. This includes the representation of more Taiwanese people in the KMT. And so that's something that's really changing the face of politics. Again, under the senior Chiang, the idea was definitely just to get back to the mainland. The ROC ran Taiwan for 30 years under the senior Chiang. And it was always just about getting back to the mainland. The son is the one who kind of understands by the 80s, the early to the mid 80s, we're not going back as conquerors for sure. Maybe someday we can work towards some reunification. But the son then is the one who starts to understand that Taiwan needs to be developed as its own place, and the talent of its own people also needs to be recognized. That's not to say, though, that the opposition, the political opposition, has an easy time. And so we're going to read a chapter from Lu's book. And so in this chapter, we see her, sorry, I don't have my notes right here, but we see her coming back from grad school. Sorry, I was a little bit relying on my notes that I had on this chapter, but moving towards this real important member of the opposition movement. And the real drama happens in 1979 when she gives what she calls the most costly speech of my life. And there's a Human Rights Day demonstration in December 1979, and she gives a speech that is, printed, I think, in its completeness in the chapter we're reading. But she's arrested for sedition 2 days later, and she ends up in prison for several years. And so the picture that you see here of her, being escorted to trial by these police officers, that picture is maybe like 8 or 9 years after the picture that's on the cover of this book. And so you can imagine kind of what she's been through in that time. I think the years have taken the toll on her as she's been part of this opposition struggle. And then on the right side, that's an ebook that's come out, I think, pretty recently by Lu. And the title that it says here is, In an Authoritarian Age, I Chose Not to Follow. And so I think that's what we like, what we love about Lu, is this real fighting spirit that she has. But obviously we have to know that she paid for it for several years. And so that's another big part of what we're looking at there, that the KMT government is giving more opportunities to Taiwanese people, accommodating the opposition more, but what they won't stand for is direct critique. So that's kind of the background. Now the film we're going to get to, Dust in the Wind, comes out in 1985, and it's by director Ho Xiaoxian, who is really a beloved director in many kind of like elite film circles, particularly Japanese film scholars and French scholars, I think, are the most crazy about Ho Xiaoxian. He's Hakka, and so that's another Chinese sub-ethnicity that we haven't really talked about. Um, we can maybe talk more about that at some other time. But as we watch this film, I think what we would want to keep in mind is this is definitely to be understood as a reaction to the emphasis on Taipei life and mainlander experience that we saw the first two films we've watched as a representative of. It's not a direct reaction to the films we watched because this movie came out several years before the ones that we've watched already. But it is to say that the films that we watched, and again, their emphasis on kind of the experiences of comfortable, well-to-do people, largely mainlander population, that was the topic of a lot of the films and a lot of TV shows and things was focusing on that group of people. It's not to say that Taiwanese people's lives were never represented. It's just that they were represented much less and in a much more kind of constrained way. So when we watch this film by Ho, that's made in 1985, it's set in the early 70s. And so the background that we should know by now from the readings we've been doing is the background of the Cold War. And so that'll come out in the military service that we see in the film. The economic boom in Taiwan that's allowed a lot of opportunity for a lot of people, but there's still a lot of poverty as well. There's still this pretty considerable gap between the city and the countryside. We're going to see this young woman here and her friend going between their mountain village and Taipei, back and forth. It's actually very, very close. The place they live is very close to Taipei City geographically, but what we'll see is it's a very long ways away, kind of socially. And so this moment in the 1970s is, for some reason, Ho wanted to look at this point in history, and he wanted to make some sort of comparisons between that city life and this village life, and to see what it was like, perhaps for young people that were part of, both of those experiences. He's really known for his I guess I should just say first, this is a very different movie from what we've seen by Ang Lee. So what we've seen obviously are these really tight plots where every conversation, every scene sets something up about a character, and it sets this up and this sets this up, and it comes and it ties off and it's funny. This is a very different kind of film. And so Ho is known for these very, very long, static shots that we'll see. Sometimes something's far in the distance. Sometimes someone's maybe close to the camera, but to the side. Often very static, where there's not even that much movement. The chronology of the film is also very different too. The storytelling. It's not a tight kind of thing where the scenes make perfect sense in terms of how they follow each other. A lot of them, as we watch, are kind of these episodes, these fragments, and it takes some imagination. It takes some kind of wondering sometimes what is in between one scene and the next scene. It probably should, and I don't think it'll be too, it's not difficult. It's not like purposely obscure or purposely confusing. It's just a different kind of filmmaking. And so I guess I'll just say that again. It's really different from what we've seen so far. It's really different from the ways I think a lot of films are made these days. But I hope that you will stick with it and try to figure out what all these long shots are about. And especially if we imagine this film to be made in the 80s, when all these changes are happening that we've been reading about, set in the 70s, when all these changes are happening that we've been reading about. What does this kind of film do? How does this tell a story, perhaps? How did this director Ho Xiaoxian come to this kind of filmmaking as a way of representing these stories? And again, the kinds of people that would not have been in like the mainstream films, that the Ang Lee's films kind of are more of the tradition of. We're going to see an encounter when we see a military service episode, and we'll see an encounter with mainland family. And so that's going to be that kind of Cold War backdrop that this is all against. But I hope that, I think that we'll have a really interesting discussion. I think it might be more difficult. I frankly think that it'll be I think it'll be a little bit tougher discussion than the ones we've had, because I think this kind of film is maybe a little bit harder to dive right into and start talking about. So I think there might be all sorts of questions. So if you have questions about what's happening, definitely write those down. We can get to those first. I mean, I think one good thing that is the case is that by now we're in the 80s, films made in the 80s, about the 70s. So we're caught up with the readings. I think one flaw that I think I've been pretty clear about in the way I've designed the syllabus is that we were watching films in the 90s and we were doing readings about the 20th century and the Japanese period and the 40s and the 50s. And there was this big gap. And I was asking you to try to make some connections if you could. That was hard. So I do realize that that's the case. But I think now it'll be a little bit easier going forward, that the readings that we have will be really about the time period that the film is made in. And so there's another article for this week on military service, and that has to do with, again, part of this film. So those are the main things I wanted to get across. I hope you enjoy this film. I plan to show it Friday at 1 o'clock. And look forward to seeing you tomorrow, and look forward to talking to you all on Monday about this wonderful, beautiful, maybe very challenging film. All right, take care.